This is a story about Charlie Sims and the weekend that changed his life forever. Charlie is a senior student at Baird, a traditional prep school for the Boston elite.
What'd you do that for? You know he's on aid.
Unlike his rich classmates with fancy surnames, Charlie comes from a poor family, which is why he's checking the job board to find some work, while George and Harry are just hanging out.
Please. Oh my God. Look at this.
Then, headmaster Mr. Trask arrives in a Jaguar. Knowing that the car is a gift from the Board of Trustees, the boys start making jokes. Trask must have jumped through a lot of hoops for such a gift.
Well, thank you. Have a Meyer.
When these rich boys bump into Charlie on their way out, Harry sees a great opportunity to humiliate a fellow student. He invites Charlie to join them for Thanksgiving, knowing all too well he can't afford skiing in Vermont.
So short it wouldn't be worth the trouble of you and George to measure.
The truth is, Charlie has a scholarship and could never attend Baird otherwise. He plans to work on Thanksgiving so he can pay for the plane ticket home for Christmas. That's how he meets Karen, a mother of two who couldn't be happier to see him. Hoping to get away with her family for a few days, she needs someone to look after her uncle, the retired Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade. He lives in a small house in her backyard. Karen says he doesn't like it when people ask him too many questions or call him sir.
Do you want Tommy in or out?
Leave him out!
Charlie begins to realize the man might be a piece of work, but Karen swears that deep down, he's a lump of sugar. That is the opposite of the first impression for sure. Charlie's fears are confirmed when Frank calls him an idiot within 5 seconds.
Intelligence, of which you have none.
Also, Karen seems to have forgotten a couple of minor details, like the fact that her uncle is A, completely blind, B, a heavy drinker, and C, verging on insanity. What happens next is simply the most painful job interview in the history of recruiting. Charlie says he comes from a poor family in Oregon.
You sharpshooting me, punk?
And Frank makes it very clear that hardship and sad stories are not gonna work with him. The man doesn't have a kind word to spare, not even to his own family. He says they're so dumb, he can't believe they're actually related. At times, Frank seems to think he's still in the army, like when he finishes the interview by yelling, "Dismissed," at the boy.
Charlie, we're up here.
Charlie drags himself upstairs to tell Karen the interview didn't go too well. She says nobody else showed up for the job, and she really needs him. She also says Frank sleeps a lot, and these will be the easiest $300 ever. But Charlie already knows better. He only takes the job because he feels bad to let her down. Something weird is happening at Baird on Monday evening. It involves Harry, Trent, Jimmy, and a very tall ladder. But wait a minute, where's George? George is leaving the library with Charlie. When they see the odd trio apparently messing with a lamppost, they start laughing.
What are you doing?
George asks them what's going on. They just tell them to keep their voice down. That's when George sees Miss Hunsacker, the school secretary. He starts to distract her while the boys flee the potential crime scene. In the morning, Mr. Trask parks his Jaguar in the usual spot. A voice coming from the loudspeaker starts to read a poem about him.
Nevertheless, about him.
While a giant air balloon inflates right above the car. It has a drawing of Trask on it, and it's not a very flattering one. Probably thinking this was the whole prank, the headmaster goes on to do exactly what the boys want him to do. He pops the balloon with the car keys, pouring gallons of white goo on himself and the Jaguar. Not very happy about this, Trask is now determined to punish the pranksters. Miss Hunsacker can't identify them, but she knows who can. Summoned to the headmaster's office, George and Charlie say they didn't see who did it.
There will be no classes, no activities.
Trask informs the boys that there will be a special session of the disciplinary committee next Monday morning. If no one's singing by then, both of them are getting expelled. After dismissing George, he has a little something extra for Charlie. Trask reveals he has the power to add one name to the Harvard list every year. All Charlie needs to do is tell him who did it, and his name will be there. He says he can take the weekend to think about it, but we know Charlie's too busy this weekend. Frank is on the phone when Charlie arrives, and it sounds like a romantic conversation. He tells him to get a bunch of stuff for him, including his old military uniform and a suitcase. Before Charlie can ask why he needs that, Karen pops in for a minute to give him her number in Albany and say goodbye to Frank. Despite everything he said before, you could almost say that he is nice to her.
No 900 numbers. He loves to talk dirty.
The moment she leaves, the nightmare begins. Frank is packing for a trip to New York City, and he'll not take no for an answer. Charlie is so surprised, he just goes with the flow, protesting timidly that no one mentioned a trip. Next thing he knows, they're at the airport with a pair of first-class tickets. Frank has a brief psycho moment when Charlie takes his arm, instead of the other way around. On the plane, we start to see some superpowers. Nothing Daredevil style, of course, but Frank shows he can easily name any perfume.
Oh, but I still smell her.
Any perfume for women, that is. Frank is an expert in women, and he talks about women in such a passionate way that Charlie can't help cracking a smile. He says he likes women above all things. A very distant second is a Ferrari. In New York, they're staying at the Welford Astoria, and Frank says he's home again. He gets on the phone to make reservations and order a limo.
Clear them little bottles off.
Charlie says he really needs to get back, and Frank replies that he can take the 10 p.m. shuttle back to Boston after dinner. On their way to the restaurant, Frank befriends the limo driver, Manny. He asks him about escort services, and Manny says he can arrange something for the Colonel. Charlie is half shocked and half amused. Then Frank says he can tell there is something troubling Charlie. After some hesitation, he tells him the whole story about the prank. When they arrive at the Oak Room, the place is so fancy that Charlie is offered a jacket to wear. Looking at the prices on the menu, he decides it's time to ask.
Are you like a rich miser or something?
How on earth is Frank paying for all this? He explains he's been saving his disability checks, but for how long has he been doing it that he could afford first-class tickets, the Waldorf Astoria, and now this place? And that's when Frank reveals his actual plan. He wants this weekend to be wonderful because it's his last.
A little tour of pleasures.
A nice hotel room, a fine meal, one last night with a beautiful woman. That's all he's asking for. And then he'll pull down the curtains. Charlie is so mortified to hear that he can't bring himself to say anything when he finds out the Boston flight actually leaves at 9 p.m. and that means he's staying for the night. He wakes up the next day with Frank singing a cheerful tune and getting his measurements taken for a tailor-made suit. Charlie calls George, who tells him to see no evil and hear no evil.
Okay, then walk like you talk.
Frank doesn't even bother to pretend he wasn't eavesdropping. He asks what George Sr. will say to this, and Charlie says they all have promised to keep parents out of this. Frank explains to him in cruel detail what's about to happen. George is gonna squeal and keep his future intact. If he decides not to, he'll lose Harvard, get kicked out of Baird, go back to Oregon, work in a store for the rest of his life, and then his last words will be, "Have a nice day, ma'am." Obviously, these words could have been chosen differently, in a much softer way, but are they untrue? Can we really say that he's too cynical after everything we saw at the school? Charlie's upset at the possibility that Frank is right, but there's no time to discuss the Baird incident now. This odd duo has a Thanksgiving party to crash at Frank's brother Willie.
Where's your miserable father?
All the family drama among the Slades is basically written on the nephew's face at the door. Then Willie is summoned and his face has a very similar expression. Charlie has some trouble explaining exactly in what capacity he's attending this family gathering. Willie seems mad at him for having brought Frank, and then everything goes downhill from there. Frank totally hijacks dinner with erotic stories until his nephew Randy snaps. Charlie's presence is an excuse for him to tell the story of how Frank lost his eyesight.
Frank was earmarked for general.
So far, no one had mentioned anything about that, so Charlie assumed he'd been injured in the line of duty. It was nothing like that. Frank was irresponsibly handling grenades after having too many drinks. One grenade got away from him and went off. Randy ends the story saying that maybe God thinks some people don't deserve to see, and then he makes a mistake.
God doth have a sense of humor.
Still talking directly to Charlie, he calls him Chucky for the second time now, after Frank told him the boy doesn't like it. Now, Frank really goes daredevil on Randy, and everyone panics. He lets go after a while and says a sad goodbye to his brother Willie. On Friday morning, a very different noise wakes Charlie up this time. Frank is trying to assemble his .45 under half a minute. Charlie had no idea that he had a gun with him, so he panics and says he's calling Karen.
I hope you have a wonderful trip.
Frank takes the piece of paper from his hands and eats it. Charlie is speechless to see this. After lots of back and forth, they reach an agreement. Charlie agrees to stay one more day in New York to guide Frank in his last tour of pleasures. And Frank gives him all the bullets. Or at least Charlie thinks those are all of them. They go to another fancy restaurant where they're playing tango music. Sitting at the table behind them, there's a stunning young lady. Charlie describes her to Frank, and he doesn't need to hear much before standing up. The girl's name is Donna, and she's waiting for someone. He offers to keep her company just to keep the womanizers from bothering her. Donna is clearly amused by such a cheeky approach. She lets them join her. At this point, Charlie had some idea about Frank's charm from his interaction with the flight attendant, the seamstress, and pretty much every female earthling that crossed their path.
Thank you, Frank.
But only now he can see the intensity of that charm, not to mention how effective it is. In less than 2 minutes, Frank convinces her to dance with him. Everyone stops to look at that beautiful pair. He not only nails his own moves, but he's also leading Donna in the most charming and effortless way.
You are one incredible incredible dancer.
As soon as the song is over and they're getting back to their table, Donna's boyfriend arrives. Anyone could tell he's an idiot right away. When they're leaving, Donna looks over her shoulder, still under some kind of spell. That same evening, Manny delivers on his earlier promise. The limo's parked outside the building and he tells Frank in which room the escort is waiting for him. Charlie takes the opportunity to call George again, but Harry picks up the phone and says George is going back to Boston. He's getting his father to intervene in their favor.
Somebody's got to talk to him.
Charlie hangs up disheartened to see Frank was right about that. When Frank returns, all he says is, "What a beautiful woman," as if he had seen her. Things start to change the next day. It's afternoon and Frank is still in bed. Charlie ventures in, trying to cheer him up. He tells Charlie where to find his plane ticket, but they seem to have swapped roles. Charlie says there's no rush to get back to Boston, while Frank is trying to get rid of the boy. Knowing what he's up to, Charlie starts to panic. He says it's a beautiful day outside and there's a lot they can do in the city. Frank seems deaf to his ideas until he says they could go for a ride. Slowly coming back to life and sitting up, he asks him what kind of ride. Now, do you remember when he told Charlie his second favorite thing in the whole world? That's right, a Ferrari.
That's a Cabriolet T, the same deal.
Now, this is a 17-year-old boy accompanied by a blind man, and he wants to test drive a crazy expensive car. Frank comes alive again when he's talking the car dealer into this madness. But his excitement doesn't last much in the passenger seat.
And unless you take it, you're gonna make me cry.
So Charlie needs to take things a step further. He drives to a calmer neighborhood and puts Frank behind the wheel. That surely does the trick, but it may also put them in a hospital because Frank starts going faster and faster. Charlie frantically begs him to slow down, but he only does when they get pulled over by a police officer.
License and registration.
Frank tells him that his license is at the dealer's and blames it all on Charlie, saying the boy wanted to see the power of such a machine and he couldn't disappoint his only son. Charlie's probably saying a prayer in his head when the officer hands back the ID, and Frank can't see that. But then the officer asks him, "You want these back or not?" And Frank is quick to take the hint. He also makes no effort to cut the conversation short, coming across as a funny guy who has nothing to be afraid of. The officer finally lets them go. Charlie declares he's not driving anymore. Frank repeats that in a sad tone, and we can see the depression coming back to him.
What's the matter with you, Colonel?
They get back to the hotel. Charlie calls George at home, but his father picks up and says he won't be talking to any friends from school right now. Frank is feeling so down he has no comments about that. He says he'll take a nap, also asking Charlie to go get some aspirins and cigars. At the hotel lobby, Charlie realizes what's happening and turns around. He goes back to their room to catch Frank in his uniform, standing in front of a loaded gun. Charlie tries to come closer, but he points the gun at him and tells him to leave. Charlie refuses and keeps telling him to put the gun down. That only makes Frank angrier. He says Charlie's integrity is a reminder of how rotten Frank is.
Oh, don't get cute now.
He has defied authority before, but it was always out of pride, while Charlie really means it. Even now, he's risking his life for someone he has just met a few days ago. Anyone else would have run out of the room at the sight of a loaded gun in the hands of a deranged man. When Frank reaches the end of a countdown, he tries to take the gun from him, and they start wrestling. Frank overpowers Charlie, but he can't bring himself to hurt the boy.
I'm in the dark here!
He backs off slowly, still refusing to surrender his weapon, but finally he agrees to put it away. Then he says the only thing that has kept him going is the thought that one day he could have a woman who would still be by his side in the morning. Charlie replies there's no reason whatsoever to think that can't happen, especially given his undeniable talents. That does cheer up the Colonel a little bit. Then Manny calls to let them know they have missed their flight. So now Manny is driving them all the way back to Boston.
I think you were right about George and his father.
As the trip is gonna take them all night, Charlie will go straight to that special session of the committee. Frank asks why he's going through this alone. Charlie says his dad left a long time ago and he doesn't get along with his stepdad. We're back to Baird now and it's time for them to part ways.
I owe you some money.
And there goes Charlie into the slaughterhouse. Trask puts on a show for the entire school as if they were in a courtroom. Charlie and George are in the witness stand across from each other. George has his father sitting right next to him, while Charlie is all alone. But not for long.
I called an open meeting of this institution this morning because—
While Trask gets started with his little travesty of a trial, Manny is walking Frank into the room. He takes the seat next to Charlie and Trask is totally taken by surprise. Frank introduces himself as a friend of the family, making up first names for Charlie's parents and getting away with it just fine.
Happy to have you with us, Colonel.
Then the show goes on. Trask asks the question and George says that he could not positively identify anyone because he didn't have his contact lenses on. There's visible tension between George Sr. and George Jr. After some more pushing, he says the boy he saw looked like Harry, Trent, and Jimmy. This is the worst thing he could have done. The boys hate him now since he did mention their names. And at the same time, that's not enough for Trask to punish them. So he turns to Charlie now and he's a lot more heavy-handed this time. He reminds him that his response today could jeopardize his future permanently.
Most any Baird student, sir.
Charlie refuses to name anyone. The boys he saw that night could have been any Baird student. Now Trask is having a cow as politely as he can, warning him that he'll recommend his expulsion to the committee. Trask says Charlie is a liar. Then Frank steps in and says, but not a snitch. He stands up to say that whatever pride and honor the school ever had is long gone if the committee decides to punish a student like Charlie.
You are executing his soul!
A student whose integrity is so intact that he's willing to bury his future for a bunch of arrogant brats he doesn't even like. A student who passed an offer to get him into Harvard, refusing to sell out. What kind of leaders are they forming at Baird? What they seem to be teaching is that you should put yourself first at all costs.
How's that for going on?
Even if Trask could provide a decent answer to these questions, which we know he can't, it's too late now. Both the students and the committee have seen the other side of this story, and their final decision is to let Charlie walk with no disciplinary measures. Charlie then leads Frank on his way out.
I teach political science.
One of his teachers comes to say how happy she is that someone finally said all that. Frank once again displays his unrivaled charm and invites her to talk politics one of these days, which she promptly accepts. And this is the end. This was a recap of the 1992 movie Scent of a Woman by City Light Films, starring Al Pacino and Chris O'Donnell. So what do you think? What would you have done if you were in Charlie's situation? Let us know in the comments below with #CinemaRecap. Until next time.